Okay, good morning. Welcome to the session 2 of our morning. We have 4 speakers. Each will have 20 minutes. I'm going to introduce them only briefly because you have their bios in your materials and because we want to stay on time. So our first speaker is John Shook from the University of Buffalo and the Center for Neurotechnology Studies at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. John is speaking on his ethical theory relevant to neuroethical evaluations of enhancing moral brains.
We have heard tremendously interesting presentations over the last couple of days. I share a lot of the skepticism towards moral enhancement. Of course, the technologies and techniques are barbarously primitive. No, there won't be a morality pill. However, I'm not that much of a skeptic. I'm interested in looking at 20, 40 years, as philosophers want to do, to look deep but dimly into things, as it's been put. So, actually, in the long term, I'm not a moral enhancement skeptic. I think there's going to be moral enhancement. In fact, I think there's going to be a lot of moral enhancement. It's going to be divided along pluralistic lines. As we've been told, morality is cracking apart. There's lots of different moral modes and cognitive systems and a lot of things that happen to be called morality. We're going to have to discriminate them. I think that pluralism is going to affect moral enhancement a great deal. I think there's going to be a lot of moral enhancement drugs. Let me rephrase that. I think there are going to be a lot of drugs and other techniques that people are going to call moral, right? So now we get into questions of authenticity and genuineness. But I'm going to even step back from that. I'm interested in the capacity of neuroethics as a discipline to even handle the question of how to consider moral enhancement, which makes me a moral enhancement, not skeptic, but cynic. I'm becoming cynical, and maybe there's a remedy for this, but let me today express the causes of my deep cynicism towards our capacity to even consider it. It might be unmanageable, for sorts of reasons intrinsic to neuroethics, actually. Expectations that neuroethics would proceed in a manner similar to other fields of applied ethics couldn't have been great. Which ethical systems could keep pretending that their foundations are unshakably secure against science? Which ethical systems are going to be able to last against this wave of understanding about the brain? Since neuroethics has easy access to new scientific understandings about how humans practice morality and how our cognitive processes function to permit moral conduct, neuroethics, least of all, could continue to regard established ethical systems as securely reliable. Plenty of fresh thinking about how ethical systems could be revised in light of these new sciences of morality is already ongoing across many disciplines. Neuroethics should consider all this work most carefully, and neuroethics should be a leader in this effort to reevaluate views about morality, whatever the source. If there are to be better theories about moral psychology, moral agency, for example, neuroethics should be in a position to find out with the assistance of allied partners in nearby fields. Ethics is changing. Neuroethics, for its part, will always be on its way to some newer ethics. Now, this paper is not about the new ethics for neuroethics. I do not have in hand the new ethical system adequate for neuroethics. I'm not sure who does. I think ethical theory is relevant to neuroscience and to neuroethics, but in perhaps surprising ways, as I'm going to try to explain. The normative dimensions of neuroethics depend on the application of ethical systems. Neuroethics appeals to ethical systems when it scrutinizes research on human subjects. Neuroethics appeals to ethical systems when it evaluates proposed modifications to things like cognitive performance. Neuroethics must appeal to ethical systems when it engages in evaluations of proposed modifications to moral performance as well. Neuroethics is stepping onto some pretty familiar territory. Parents are already heavily involved in moral enhancement by traditional methods. There are 3 primary ways that neuroethics must appeal to ethical systems when undertaking any consideration of moral judgment and moral enhancement. First, any consideration of moral enhancement must rely on some prior understanding, fallible, tentative, local, but some prior understanding of what kinds of human conduct are to be classified as relevant to moral performance. What does being moral concretely mean? What counts as moral performance? Neuroethicists will at least, at minimum, go about their business of passing evaluations and judgments by relying on their own personal or perhaps their own society's views of what basically counts as minimal moral performance. Second, any consideration of moral enhancement must rely upon some ideas about how people manage to meet at least local standards of morality, to the extent they do, using the psychological skills available to them. Neuroethicists will then at least apply some folk psychology, if not some enhanced psychology, for theorizing about the mental processes involved with better and worse moral performance by ordinary people. Third, any consideration of moral enhancement must rely on notions about how those mental processes involved in morality may be modified in ways that eventually result in real adjustments to people's conduct along moral dimensions. Again, whatever we take to mean by moral. Once again, some folk psychology can supply those needed notions about mental processes, and more sophisticated ethical theories have suggestions as well, and of course science is going to be affecting all of these things. Finally, relying on those prior standards for what minimally counts as moral performance, once again, neuroethicists can judge which modified processes actually manage to adjust moral performance in desirable directions. That is to say, neuroethicists would then be in a position to determine which modifications do make the person more moral. These are at least the minimum conditions. Problems ensue. Folk, cultural, religious traditions, or ethical, metaethical philosophies, all these ethical systems, to just sort of gather them together under one broad label so I can use the word ethical system without having to repeat all of the subparts. They postulate matters about morality that could be empirically disconfirmed. Theories about people being moral and becoming more moral must at least make 4 kinds of presumptions about things like how people are doing morality already, some specified sense of morality, the psychological processes that people undertake when trying to be moral, how certain changes to these processes are possible, and how some of these changes can result in the person's conduct becoming more moral. Anything that may look like an ethical theory, but is silent about these 4 matters, has nothing to say about ways for individuals to improve their moral performance, and so we won't be considering them here today. A normative theory of moral standards by itself, just simply specifying such things as virtues or rules of conduct, but devoid of suggestions for people trying to better reach those moral standards, is not an ethical theory in the full sense that I'm describing in this talk. So here are the ways that ethical theories can be discredited. A theory's specified sense of morality may not resemble how humans generally do morality. A theory's view of cognitive processes, to use one broad label for all of those affective, cognitive, and social processes. When you hear me use cognitive processes, I just don't mean cognitive process as a shorthand. All of those processes that are studied by the brain sciences that are involved in doing morality may be inaccurate or entirely mistaken. A theory may be proposing modifications to processes involved in moral performance that are not in fact possible. Or a theory's proposed modifications to moral processes could be impossible, but they could not have much effect on actual moral performance. Now some, but not all, ethical philosophies and systems are refuted by such discoveries as these. Many people are not fulfilling morality's altruistic expectations. People's moral intuitions have emotional roles set by evolution instead of cognitive ways to track moral realities. People's intuitive notions about how morality works may be quite mistaken, and ordinary language about morality is replete with confusions and errors. These are long-standing complaints. Ethical philosophies do not all agree about the motivational or cognitive capacities of ordinary morality. They don't all share the same degree of reliance on what people happen to think or say about morality. So ethical systems can survive, but they can also be discredited. I'm interested in ways that they might be surviving. Consider this neuroethics trilemma. A, B, and C, in the manner intended here, cannot all be true at the same time. A, neuroethics prioritizes information concerning morality, moral development, and so forth, discovered by the life, behavioral, and cognitive sciences. B, established sources of views on morality, these ethical systems that I've been lumping together, postulate some matters about morality that can be empirically disconfirmed by the sciences, and we've seen why. C, neuroethics can appeal to some established ethical systems for reliable guidance about what constitutes morality, moral agency, etc., and about what standards are applicable for making moral evaluations and recommendations. The basic problem is, because neuroethics has access to the science of how we do morality, the very ground of how to do normative neuroethics is shifting under the very feet of neuroethics as we speak. How can we manage this situation? Well, there's some options. Option A, resort to the armchair. Back to the armchair might be the cry, especially of philosophers. Neuroethics could instead prioritize other additional sources of information about human sociality, morality, and moral agency, which are not so empirically disconfirmable. Perhaps some core aspects of established ethical systems, such as their traditional social norms, folk moral psychologies, moral phenomenologies, moral intuitions, moral grammars, metaethical axioms. Maybe these are immunizable from falsification by any amount of factual information about human behavior and cognition. In other words, a sort of retreat to the ought to hide from the is, right? Call this the traditional ethics option. However, probably not a smart idea for neuroethics to go down that road, since neuroethics would be very different without firmly prioritizing the life, behavioral, and cognitive sciences, and getting involved in immunizing other traditional forms of moral knowledge seems kind of alien to the scientific spirit of morality. Let's not try that. Option B. This is the really interesting one, I think. Some established ethical systems could mutate to stay consistent with all of this science. And neuroethics could then appeal, once it turns around and does its normative work, it could appeal to only those successfully adapted ethical systems. Perhaps one or another suitably enhanced cultural or ethical system could eventually receive ample confirmation for the sciences. In fact, multiple ones could. Call this the enhancing ethics option. Pursuing this option involves putting neuroethical pressure on ethical systems to modify such things as their views on moral psychology, moral agency, practical means for heightening moral performance. Neuroethical pressure on ethical systems to evolve can result in ethics paradigms mutating to stay confirmed by the behavioral and brain sciences. Folk moral psychologies would mostly get weeded out, or most of them would get weeded out as largely disconfirmed. However, ethics paradigms could absorb any surviving ideas from folk psychology that happen to continue to get some degree of confirmation. But there also would be a lot of creativity involved. If neuroethics doesn't possess the criteria for ethical enhancement now, though, it probably never will. Each ethical system can mutate to adjust its views to avoid outright falsification and to positively improve by seeking maximal continuity and coherence among special stances about morality and moral performance. Does this sound familiar? That's why I'm using the word paradigm. These ethical systems are not going to become scientific paradigms. This is just a loose analogy to help us think about what's happening in the future, although there's some interesting family resemblances that I'm going to draw upon. Individual neuroethicists who are already committed to one or another ethical system or mutation of an ethical system can participate in that system's gradual enhancement. From the wider stance of neuroethics as a field, however, what would emerge is the general criteria for judging one or another ethical system as more successfully adaptive. Several ethical systems in the future might simultaneously claim high coherence with the relevant, correctly interpreted evidence. Naturally, however, each ethical system will regard itself as the preferable authority over what counts as genuine evidence truly relevant to its views on moral agency and performance. Any ethical system feeling that prejudiced evidence is held against it will complain about the unfair imposition of things like irrelevant or wrongly interpreted data. If it is the case that any thick interpretation of cognitive functioning, able to bear upon the adequacy of an ethical system, is an interpretation itself depending on formative assumptions about what sorts of cognitive processes are more relevant to genuine moral conduct, and any robust set of assumptions about the truly moral cognitive processes itself constitutes the core of another moral psychology, then these ethical systems will just view some upstart moral psychology as another rival ethical system and not any sort of fair standard to judge its adequacy against. Any researcher would be quite naive to suppose that the correct portrait of genuine moral cognition will swim into view with the accumulation of enough details about the interconnections of neural modules and the patterns of their activations. In fact, the project of enhancing ethics could reach the point where many multiple and overlapping ethical paradigms and the corresponding kinds of ethical brains populate the field, all able to claim plenty of evidential justification from the sciences. For every sort of moral person, there is a specific sort of moral brain in action. Traditional ethical theories, supposing that there's a single moral faculty or that moral cognition has a fairly unified structure, these are already being disproven. Diversity of moral cognition will support a kind of neurological moral pluralism. Classifying moral brains by their characteristic paradigms could come to challenge the currently popular manner of classifying personality types. We're looking at a situation of paradigm pluralism The project of ethical enhancement might not result in any sort of convergence upon one approved ethical system, but instead a diversity of long-standing, easy surviving ethical paradigms. Traditional ethical theorizing could sort of get stuck, as a matter of fact. I mean, this wouldn't be my criticism out of my own mouth, but you could imagine criticism sort of saying, look, the way that some brains are capable of thinking deontologically and others in a utilitarian manner when confronted with some artificial situation doesn't really help too much. I mean, you know, it'd be sort of as if you could use brain scans to decide which 18th century epistemology was more correct. But that would be an uncharitable interpretation, of course, of what's going on, because you need some sort of ethical system, some sort of postulates about what human beings are doing when they're doing morality, even to just get started interpreting things as these interesting brain scans that we see from presenters. But the point is, these things are going to evolve. Ethical systems will survive. Now, there is a third system, a third option. Neuroethics could just go alone. It could declare all these traditional ethical systems, even if they could mutate, irrelevant. Just re-engineer ethics. Neuroethics could just regard them all as potentially or actually unreliable and just go about constructing a new ethical system about what constitutes morality, moral performance, moral agency, moral responsibility, even in a fragmented way. Could sort of collect it together and say, this is what we're going to call engineering ethics. It would have high confirmation from the sciences, but what else would it be able to do? Here comes the problem. The same trilemma affects moral enhancement. It should look familiar. It's the same version of the trilemma before. How are we going to judge moral enhancement? We've got the options. Ethical paradigms, pluralism, relativism perhaps, or hope for convergence. Could we design some sort of ethical system that's going to allow us to judge genuine moral enhancement? You get the same three options. I call them grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. And these are the basic options as far as neuroethics is concerned. Some of these things are already happening already. In fact, divergence of views, disagreements and so forth are emerging along these three lines, grade 1 versus grade 2, or grade 1 versus grade 3. Grade 1 is kind of this sort of standoffish skepticism towards all this ethical theorizing. Just go back to traditional ethics. We're probably not going to do any better. We're not going to solve the relativism problem, but it might be all we got. This amounts to what I call neuroadvice. And most of what you actually see published in neuroethics constitutes neuroadvice. In other words, the neuroethicist is saying, well, according to our current social, cultural, legal standards, that's probably a really bad idea, if not outright wrong. Or it does. It's neuroadvice. It's like running an advice column. These things are very valuable. No, I mean, it's valuable. I mean, it's how you carry on what you've sort of already been doing. Grade 2 and grade 3 are the ones that interest me the most as far as the next couple of decades are involved with neuroethics. I don't know if grade 2 or grade 3 are going to be possible or even practical, but you are going to see neuroethicists dividing along these lines. Go with ethics paradigms. Grade 2 moral enhancement would be guided by those enhanced ethics paradigms that continue to enjoy the most confirmations and the least disconfirmations from the behavioral and brain sciences. The problem is I don't see convergence down this road. There's no, right, what would be the crucial experiment that would finally decide whether a super enhanced sort of utilitarian way of thinking is better than a super enhanced version of deontology? Just maybe say we need both. Or maybe a third one's even better. Maybe virtue ethics is going to really prove that its resurgence is deserved. Some fourth thing, who knows, right? But you get a lot of relativism. So you can imagine that we could reach grade 2 moral enhancement, liberation from traditional ethics, but just run into a sort of paradigm relativism. Grade 3 is engineered ethics, the hope for convergence, independence from all of the past systems, some sort of uniquely designed neuroethical system, complete with normative standards for what's going to constitute morality, freshly engineered from the best behavioral and brain sciences. This would amount to establishing the objective ethics of neuroethics. I'm cynical towards that, and maybe you are too. I just don't know how that's going to become possible. But nevertheless, I think many people are going to sort of embrace this hope, especially if they have some sort of ethics vision of where the world ought to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And our next speaker is Bill Capacenci from Washington State University. He'll be speaking on enhancing for virtue towards holistic moral enhancement.
I think every one of these possibilities is already mentioned, so I'm not going to say anything about it. So let me get right to the questions that I'm thinking about when I think about moral enhancement. I was intrigued. I ran across something that James Hughes wrote, in which he used the phrase virtue engineering. Are you the originator of that phrase?
I don't wait.
Okay. I don't know if I could find an older publication, so we'll give you credit at least for that. And I was intrigued by the possibility of being able to engineer virtues into a person. Right? Is that what we're doing when we do moral enhancement? And that led me to two follow-up questions that kind of frame what I want to talk about today. The first is, how do the character traits that we might produce using biomedical methods of moral enhancement compare to the sorts of character traits that have been prized in more traditional virtue-based approaches to ethics? So that's most of the talk, comparing what we might be able to get with biomedical enhancement with traditional conceptions of virtue. And the second part of the talk, or actually really just a brief tail end of the talk, is how might we use biomedical enhancement technologies to facilitate the kind of moral development that's worth pursuing in an evolution like today, which I have. So, I do have two assumptions going in. One is that virtues are constitutive or at least a reliable means to human flourishing. I think that matters, right? I think that ethics is generally speaking about human flourishing, so it matters. Even if the whole story of ethics isn't told by a virtue-based approach to ethics, and I don't think it is, nonetheless, virtues are an important part of the whole properly nuanced story. And so one assumption is that we should be interested in the question specifically of whether biomedical moral enhancement will actually enable us to engineer virtues into a person. That would be an important part of biomedical enhancement if we do it. And the second assumption, that virtue engineering is actually about trying to produce virtues and not just a synonym as it sometimes is for the term ethics. So those are the two assumptions that are kind of driving my thinking here. So, three parts to a traditional understanding of virtues. By traditional, I'm going to mean Aristotle. Action, emotion, and practical wisdom and reasoning that attends to that. A little bit of textual evidence from the Nicomachean Ethics. By virtue, I mean a virtue of character. This is about feelings and actions, and easy hit of excess, deficiency, and immediate conditions. So, in the first quote, you have Aristotle mentioning the first three components that I'm interested in. Actions, and then emotions or feelings. I think it's worth noting that it wouldn't be enough to have a virtue-based approach to ethics that was focused exclusively on actions. If you had that, you would be able to explain Aristotle's own understanding of moral development from the continent state, right, to the fully virtuous state. I think that transformation is best understood in terms of whereas the continent person knows what they ought to do and manages to do it, right, with a bit of self-control, grit of the teeth, the fully virtuous person enjoys an inner emotional state that is consistent with what they recognize as the appropriate action to perform. So really, to understand moral development, as Aristotle does, you need to have both actions and emotions be a part of a virtue. Right? And then the last quote brings in the third of practical wisdom. Aristotle says that virtue is a state that decides, consisting in being the result of us, which is defined by reference to reason. So again, this should be, to philosophers in the crowd, there should be nothing new here. This is standard Aristotelian virtue ethics. So let's look at each of these in just a little bit more detail. First of all, actions. So imagine that you went to Starbucks this morning to get some coffee to keep you going through the last of this rigorous last day of this rigorous conference. And there are two people working on the counter. Let's call them Jason and David. And Jason and David both conform, at least on the outside, to the employee handbook at Starbucks. I'm told that affiliative behavior is one of the prized attributes of a good Starbucks employee, affiliative behavior. But as it turns out, Jason does it with sort of disguised gritted teeth. He's pretty impatient, and unfortunately his impatience is especially triggered by the presence and activities of certain racial minorities. So in other words, he's prone to impatience and anger, and that's triggered specifically by some racist tendencies that he has. But he does a pretty good job managing it, and so employees never really get a sense that this is the case, that this is sort of his internal moral psychology. Because on the outside, he's doing the same thing as his colleague, David, who not only does the right thing, demonstrates affiliative behavior, but he actually kind of likes it. He enjoys seeing people every day. He knows what certain people like, and he's happy to see them. And he doesn't have the sort of inner conflict or inner turmoil that Jason does. So we should distinguish between the acts that both of them perform, the public performances, and the inner context. We can make a distinction between their acts and their actions. Their actions, arguably, are quite different, right? If we think about the character, the internal character of the actions. So a quote from Bob Roberts in a book called Emotions, an essay made of moral psychology, he said, emotions are not just causes of action, they also determine the identity of our actions. It matters what kind of emotional state you're acting from for discerning exactly what action you're performing. And so this is to say that holistic action from virtue is going to be action that is sort of consistent with the larger conception of the virtue, not just doing the right thing, the way that Jason does it in Starbucks. And that sort of leads quite naturally into a second component of ethics, emotions and feelings. So I'll use Roberts a bit more. Roberts takes a view of emotions. They're concern-based construals. And I think this is actually consistent with Aristotle. In the rhetoric, Aristotle talks about anger as a kind of perception. And so a concern-based construal would be a construal of whatever the object of the emotion is. Maybe it's something that someone did to you or a narrative event. Right? And it's construing it in terms of or in light of, through the lens of certain kinds of concerns. So Roberts will use some of Wittgenstein's Gestalt language, the duck rabbit, and that sort of thing, to animate this idea that an emotion is a construal of an event, of the object of the emotion, but in the light of certain concerns. So if I'm happy that my son did well in his soccer game yesterday, that's because I have concerns about his well-being and his athletic and other forms of development, and so I construe his success on the soccer field in terms of this set of concerns that I have for his well-being, for his flourishing. And so this is an account of emotions that prizes what sort of concerns we have. You can see quite easily how emotions could take on a moral balance, right? If you have the right sorts of concerns, you're likely to have what Aristotle and others would call apt emotions, appropriately formed emotions. But on the other hand, if you have the wrong sorts of concerns, you get angry at the wrong things or to too great a degree, and so on and so forth. And so a holistic conception of virtue is going to have to incorporate the right kinds of concerns such that we have the right kinds of emotional dispositions. And I think that, although I don't have time to develop this idea, I think that this is an account that incorporates both cognitive and can happily accept physiological components of emotion as well. Like Tamar Gambler mentioned yesterday, her fascination with emotions that we experience in the account of fictional narratives, right? And if you think about it, if you go and see a scary movie, you can actually have physiological reactions, despite the fact that you know full well that you're not in any danger. There is no danger from the movie sitting in the movie theater. But nonetheless, we feel kind of physiological responses that are sort of activated by these concern-based construals that we have. And then the third component of virtue on this traditional account is practical wisdom, sort of reasoning from it. Recently, Julia Annis has been doing a lot of work defending an intellectualist account of virtue. So a quote from her where she talks about virtue as involving acting reliably for certain reasons, right? Not just for any reason, but for certain kinds of reasons. So this is part of what it means to embody virtue on an Aristotelian account of virtues. But then going back to Aristotle a little bit, we have to note a sort of a holism. That's where the holism in the subtitle of my talk comes from. Aristotle says that prudence, practical wisdom, phronesis in the Greek, desire the soul requires virtue in order to reach its fully developed state. So in other words, you need virtue in order to have practical wisdom. And a little bit later, just sort of one page over, he says full virtue cannot be acquired without prudence, without practical wisdom. And so he sees a kind of interplay between virtue and practical wisdom. And so from these three components, particularly the emotions which are captured, the emotion dispositions which sort of embody certain sorts of moral concerns, and the practical wisdom which in some cases will draw on the emotions to pick out the most salient features of a situation such that we know how to act in practical kinds of ways. This involves a kind of moral content. And so my initial sense when thinking about this sort of full-blooded traditional conception of the virtue is that I just don't see how any particular mechanism of moral enhancement that has been discussed so far could actually incorporate into a person the kind of moral content that's captured in the concerns that make up the emotion dispositions of a fully virtuous agent, and in practical reasoning that they do on the basis of those emotion dispositions and other features of their intellectual life. Right, so, again, when we look at this picture, the picture of the three components of the virtue, I just don't see a way to biomedical enhancement as it's being talked about, as the possibilities are being discussed in this day and age, are going to be able to achieve this kind of conception of virtue. And then one sort of illustration to kind of make the case for the difference that this might make. So, and I know this is enough from the actually called my attention to these studies. Paul Zak has done a number of studies which have found that oxytocin increases generosity and trust. But then, and that seems like a good thing, right? Trust is a virtue. But then Thomas Baumgartner and colleagues have found that giving oxytocin also makes an individual less likely to modify their trusting behavior, even when they've been informed about breaches of trust. Right? And when we think about the virtue of trust, and I think it is important to recognize that this is a virtue that's an important part of our flourishing. If you think that relationships of intimacy are part of, constitutive of the flourishing of a human being, well, then you're going to need to embody the virtue of trust. But the virtue of trust, of course, is going to involve being able to trust people in the right ways, in the right context, and for the right reasons, but also being able to recognize when distrust is called for. And so there's an element of practical wisdom in how you express and operationalize this virtue in the context of particular relationships. And this set of studies suggests that what you can get with oxytocin is not exactly the virtue of trust, but that what we should really want, of course, is the virtue of trust. Okay. So that's this is sort of a somewhat skeptical assessment of the prospects for biomedical enhancement for actually engineering virtues into a person. But being a sort of second wave thinker about these sorts of things, I do want to conclude with some thinking about what we might do nonetheless with the technologies that are available to us. And all this is inspired by my son. There he is up in the mountains. He's 10 years old, and he's not atypical in that around 4:45 or 5 o'clock in the evening, he gets a little grouchy, and his behavior tends to deteriorate. And for a while, I'm a philosopher, so my inclination is to try to talk to him and get him to do something different by talk therapy, if you will. My wife does something different. She'll take a half a banana and shove it in his mouth. Okay? So in other words, her approach to this, very wise, I think, compared to my own, her approach to this is to say what he needs is actually a change in his biological context. Right? He needs to boost his blood sugar, tryptophan or something like that. He needs an altered biological context such that he can actually act on the kinds of concerns and reasons that at the end of the day I think he does want to act on, he's learning to want to act on, but that he can't do at that particular time of day when his biological context doesn't allow it so much. And so it seems to me that some of the biomedical enhancements that we've been talking about and will be talking about for the rest of the day, that these could actually have a helpful function in as aids in moral formation by means of creating the right sort of biological context. It might be that some people have specific deficits which could be addressed by specific, relatively targeted biomedical technologies, drugs of one kind or another. It may be that everybody could benefit from a sort of enhanced biological context. But again, I think the lesson to learn from this is that the biomedical enhancements are not producing virtues, but they can provide the right kind of biological conditions, the right kind of biological context for engaging in the sort of moral development that is worth pursuing. Someone might worry, this was a topic of discussion in the panel last night, someone might worry that this is a somewhat inauthentic way of doing moral formation. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Alan Buchanan recently in his book Beyond Humanity took on that objection and pointed out, and I think he's right about this, that if authenticity means that you and only you do everything that's relevant, do everything that's important for your moral formation, then none of us can claim moral authenticity as far as we had mothers putting bananas in our mouths at 4:45 in the evening to help us have the right sort of biological context, the conditions for thinking about how we're treating family members or something like that. In other words, for all of us, many people are contributing to moral formation, and so the fact that we might use a pill to engage in moral formation is perhaps not so different from getting a good meal or doing something else to create the right sort of biological context. So I'm not so sure that the authenticity worry, at least if the authenticity worry is it's inauthentic to use a pill. If that's the worry, then we would have to say it's as inauthentic to use other means that we often use to create the right kind of biological conditions for moral formation. But on the other hand, if we think about that neo-Aristotelian and traditional account of virtues and the kind of moral content that a person wants to be able to embody, if they want those kinds of virtues, then we should be asking, well, what are the means by which we can engage in moral formation? And I'm struck by the lack of discussion in contemporary philosophy about different methods of moral formation. Apparently the same is true in psychology, according to the discussion panel from yesterday. And this is interesting, especially when you consider the fact that in ancient philosophy, there was all kinds of discussion of different embodied practices that people might engage in. James mentioned this just a second ago in his talk. Things like fasting, there's a passage where Plato and Socrates actually talks about standing and facing in a certain direction for an entire day in order to sort of bore into his mind a particular idea that he was wanting to reflect on. So these kinds of embodied practices, it seems to me, could be nicely coupled with our attempts to create the right kind of biological context. In a way, there are actually other means of creating the right kind of biological context. But the thing that's striking about the embodied practices that I have in mind is that these are means by which we could come to really internalize some of what I call the moral content. Again, concerns that animate certain kinds of emotion dispositions and the kinds of concerns that would also be operative in a practical reason. And so I think that the kind of moral formation we should be especially interested in would be moral formation that pursues holistic virtues and would be happy to use biomedical means, but also a variety of other kinds of practices and methods for achieving full virtue. And with that, I'll close.
Our next speaker is Molly Crockett from the University of Zurich, and she'll be speaking on moral enhancement, evidence, and challenges.
Today I'm just going to give some sort of loosely structured thoughts that I've had about this question of whether we could create a morality pill. And I'm actually very pleased to announce that my colleagues and I have developed a morality pill, and we're very grateful to the organizers of this conference because we put in the coffee. April Fools. We get this question a lot from people outside the field because we're now doing some studies where we sort of use different pharmacological manipulations and test how they affect people's behavior in social situations and their moral judgment and these more classic sort of tests coming from philosophy, Kelly problems, and so on and so forth. And I get this question quite a lot, quite a bit more than I'm maybe comfortable with, because when I hear this question as a neuroscientist who study these things, I find it a really crazy question, because these systems are just so complicated. So what I'm going to do in this short time is try to sort of convey the kind of bewilderment that I feel when I hear this question, and some sort of thoughts from our side of the field about the kinds of challenges that we might face if we were to try to develop this kind of technology, as well as what evidence exists so far that sort of bears on this question. So to start with, I will just talk about a couple of case studies, oxytocin and serotonin, which are kind of, I think, tossed around the most when we consider this question of pharmacological means of moral enhancement. And then I'll focus on sort of three broad, rough areas of challenges that I think, both from a practical sense as well as a more ethical sense. So I'll talk about context sensitivity of these systems, I'll talk about neuroanatomy, and I'll talk about issues of timing. So to start with oxytocin, I think that's probably the molecule that is most talked about in the context of moral behavior, social behavior. This is a book coming out by Paul Zak at Claremont called The Moral Molecule, The Source of Love and Prosperity. I haven't actually read the book, but I'm going to guess that the moral molecule, according to Paul Zak, is oxytocin. And the answer to this question is morality chemical. Would seem that he's advocating for this, although we'll have to see when the book comes out. So from my perspective, there's been a lot of research on oxytocin, and a lot of it does show things like oxytocin enhances certain measures of empathy. So this is just one study where it looks like, oh shoot, we're going to have a Mac to PC issue throughout this talk, so sorry about that. That's unfortunate. Anyhow, subjects were shown pictures that were depicting people in sort of negative situations as well as positive situations, and they were asked to sort of rate how much they feel what the person in the picture is feeling. And the general finding is that for both positive and negative emotions, administering oxytocin through this nasal spray process sort of increased people's ratings of empathy both for positive and negative emotions. There are, of course, the classic studies on oxytocin and trust. So this is work by Michael Kosfeld, Ernst Fair, and colleagues, published in Nature in 2005, showing that administering oxytocin increases the amount of money that's invested in this trust game where you can send money to another person. That money then triples, and he or she has the option to send some of that money back to you. So they looked at sort of investment decisions by first movers and found that relative to a control condition that was non-social, so investing money in a sort of computer program that could send money back to you, individuals on oxytocin in black here were more likely to send the maximum amount of money. This is sort of a test on distribution. So this has been replicated a few times, and I trust this data. It's unclear sort of what underlying psychological processes are involved, and it does look like there's something to do with anxiety or arousal. But this is a robust finding. But there's a dark side to oxytocin research that is often glossed over, especially by individuals who are motivated to pursue a story that oxytocin is all about love and hugs and happiness. So this is a study by Shelby Tori et al., published in Biological Psychiatry. They had subjects playing a game, sort of an investment game, where they could win or lose money, and also their partner could win or lose money, and then they observed their own outcome and the other's outcome, and completed ratings of emotions like envy and schadenfreude or gloating. And what they found was that when subjects were in a relative loss position, oxytocin increased feelings of envy. And when subjects were in a relative gain position, oxytocin increased feelings of schadenfreude or gloating. So on the one hand, while trust and empathy may in certain instances seem like emotions or virtues that might be worth enhancing, if what comes as part of the package is also an increase in envy and gloating, then it's sort of, the picture becomes a little less clear. Similarly, there's been some work suggesting that oxytocin also influences or enhances feelings of ethnocentrism, or sort of in-group, out-group distinction behavior. So this is studied by Carson and Drew, published last year. They gave subjects these classic trolley problems, and they manipulated who was going to be harmed, the identity, whether this is someone in your in-group or someone in your out-group. They found is on placebo, you're slightly more likely to harm someone who's an out-group member to save lives. That this tendency was significantly enhanced by administering oxytocin. So this is sort of adds complication to the puzzle, and if you're interested in this, I highly recommend this article that came out last year by Brevard's, Jamil Zaki and colleagues, which gives a broad survey of the oxytocin literature, arrives at the conclusion that the effects of oxytocin are really complicated, that they interact with features of the individual and features of the environment. So this is a somewhat complicated diagram, but essentially you have administration of oxytocin, which comes into the sort of situation of study, contextual and situational factors feed in, individual differences feed in, and there's sort of an interaction amongst mechanisms that produces the effects of oxytocin, whereby, there are lots of interactions when it comes to administering oxytocin and observing the effects on behavior. Oftentimes, the effects of oxytocin depend on features of the situation, or they depend on features of the person, or both. So whether you can make sweeping statements about oxytocin being a whole molecule, I'm not so convinced. Another aspect of, or another candidate molecule, so to speak, is serotonin. So this comes from a commentary from a paper from my colleagues in PNAS a couple of years ago. We showed, I think I'm going to show this now. So we showed that by giving subjects impersonal and personal trolley dilemmas, we found that administering a drug that influences serotonin changes people's moral judgments in this paradigm. I'll go through that in a second, but just to go back to the commentary, there was sort of the way that this finding was talked about is that serotonin makes people more moral, potentially. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that. So the story is, of course, more complicated, as is going to be a recurring theme. So what we found, for those of you who weren't here yesterday for my talk, we compared the effects of two drugs, atomoxetine and citalopram, with placebo on judgment in neutral scenarios for which there were no differences between treatments. Impersonal moral dilemmas like the switch case, where you're harming one to save many, but there's sort of no emotional salience in the situation. Again, no differences between the drugs. In the personal cases, where the harms were described in relatively emotionally salient terms, we find that citalopram makes people less willing to save the guy off a bridge to save the trolley who's saving the bot, relative to both other drugs. So that suggested to us that subjects on citalopram were sort of more averse to harming others. This was also reflected in some other studies that we did, looking at the effects of serotonin manipulations on willingness to punish transgressions, to harm someone who's harmed you. So this is sort of coming to a recurring theme for serotonin and harm aversion. But again, is this a moral enhancement? It really depends on who you ask, right? So in some cases, of course, making people less willing to harm someone is a morally appropriate or good thing. But in other cases, harming one to save many others can be construed as a moral action. So it's really important, I think, to dialogue with people working in ethics to sort of, this I see as a separate question, is sort of first figuring out sort of what we think is moral, which it doesn't seem like we're going to agree on that anytime soon, since the debate has been going on for what seems like thousands of years. But, I mean, of course, we think about these issues. So this sort of leads me to the first, and I think the most important challenge of developing technologies for moral enhancement, which is that moral systems, moral behaviors, and social behaviors more generally are highly context sensitive. And this is actually a really adaptive feature of our social cognitive apparatus because, we help each other out, but not unconditionally. We're conditionally cooperative. So you scratch my back, I scratch yours, and this has facilitated the evolution of cooperation and contributed to what has made humans a highly successful species. To try and make people into unconditional cooperators, unconditionally trusting, unconditionally empathetic, is maybe not such a good idea because if you're unconditionally cooperative, unconditionally trusting, et cetera, we have actually a technical term for you. And no one obviously wants to be a sucker. So as I think a lot of the other speakers have really nicely demonstrated, these systems are these emotional processes, these social cognitions are embedded within a highly intricate and well-adapted apparatus that going into tampering with is not so straightforward. And so that leads me to the second challenge, which is the neuroanatomy of these systems is incredibly complicated. So these are the four major neuromodulator systems in the brain. So these are the systems upon which most psychopharmacological tools that are in existence today are acting on. So you have adrenaline, drugs like adenosine, propranolol, working on here, serotonin, of course, which I talked a lot about, SSRIs, antidepressants, so on and so forth. Dopamine, on which antipsychotics, L-DOPA are working, and acetylcholine, which is involved in memory, so lots of Alzheimer's drugs work on this system. These are rat brains, by the way, because I don't have the equivalent picture in human brains, but these systems are really well conserved across mammals, which is good because then we can use animal models to really test and develop drugs acting on these systems. The cells that produce and release these chemicals originate in the brainstem, and then their axons then project to the rest of the brain. And as you can see from these diagrams, it's not like serotonin neurons go to one site in the brain. They go to lots of different sites in the brain. And the same holds true for all the chemical systems. And there's a point to that. These systems, we think, evolved to sort of produce state-dependent global changes in brain function that are adapted for the situation that you're in. So the consequence of this, of course, is that if you manipulate the serotonin system, or the dopamine system, you're going to have effects that are very widespread in terms of behavior. So in the case of oxytocin, for example, yes, behavioral studies have shown that it influences empathy, generosity, and trust, but also it's involved in lots of other things like reproductive physiology, plasticity, learning and memory, stress, anxiety, addiction, attention, arousal. This is just like I did a very quick PubMed search and just picked sort of the first 2 pages. So lots and lots of things that oxytocin is involved in, and for serotonin it's even worse. So harm, aversion, and fairness, yes, but also sleep, appetite, sexual behavior, learning, memory, vision, digestion, stress, mood, motor activity, development, anxiety, addiction, pain, so on and so forth. Serotonin especially is complicated. There's something like 17 different receptor subtypes that are known, and there's sort of even more that are becoming discovered as the years go by. So, this is not at all straightforward, and I think, the way that a lot of these chemicals are portrayed in the media is like, oh, we just give someone a pill, they become nice, and that would be really great, honestly, but from my perspective, it just seems extremely unrealistic. And so the point is that the tools that we have for manipulating these systems are extremely blunt, because you can only really, in humans at least, target these systems at a global level. And so it's just I see the possibility of more targeted interventions as being quite some time away. I mean, there are great advancements happening in the animal model literature, optogenetics, so on and so forth. So we're getting there, but it's not going to happen tomorrow by any means. The third challenge is one of timing, and this is sort of less of a challenge, but more just something to think about when we're considering pharmacological tools for moral enhancement. So the effects of drugs in the brain are short-lived. It depends on the drug you're talking about, but as we know from psychiatry, it's not like you give someone one pill and then they're better. Even in the case of antibiotics, you can give someone a course of antibiotics, and then that cures the infection. With psychiatric medications, you have to continually be on the drug, and it sort of supports a certain behavioral change that is not permanent. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, and I can think of several examples of cases in which, suppose we were to have a fantastic drug that targeted exactly what we wanted to target, it could be actually a good thing that this would be a reversible manipulation and only a temporary one, as we can imagine. If we could find a way to pharmacologically help judges to be more impartial, then it would be good to administer that for the duration of their session, but maybe not out of the rest of their lives, or with surgeons or with soldiers or so on and so forth. So I think impermanence is probably a good feature, but it's just something to keep in mind, especially if we're interested in sort of long-term support of moral enhancement, particularly in a population like psychopaths, where we would want to try and permanently change them. Unless you're sort of a manufacturer of the drug who obviously has an interest in continued use of this, it's something to think about. So I'll just conclude by sort of talking about a few areas of what I think could fall under the category of non-pharmacological moral enhancement, and how those might be synergistic with pharmacological approaches. So there's one paper that came out last year, which I thought was really cool, looking at how you could change people's willingness to negotiate in a conflict by changing their beliefs about what the other side is like. So this is by Weck colleagues. And they looked at Israeli and Palestinian citizens and primed them to believe that groups are either changeable or not. And those who were led to believe that, or were given evidence suggesting that groups could change their views, were more likely to be willing to negotiate with the other side and talk on these really contentious issues. So we know that we're learning a lot about the neuroscience of belief formation. So one could imagine coming up with interventions that could sort of synergistically work with this process. Similarly, we know that, for example, meditation changes the brain. So there have been a couple of studies now showing that if you sort of compare experienced and non-experienced meditators, or if you actually track people over the course of meditation training, that this changes neural responses in emotional processing regions, as well as changes the volume of brain areas like the hippocampus. So we do know that behavioral interventions like meditation or like education can change the brain. So it's possible that pharmacological interventions could facilitate this process. So we talked about this a bit on the panel yesterday with Walters and Armstrong about how you could maybe use pharmacological tools to enhance or facilitate non-pharmacological moral education processes that are already taking place. So that's it. Just to sum up, the challenges that I really see we should be talking about are the context sensitivity, the fact that these neuroanatomical systems are really complicated and widespread, and issues of timing, and just thank you to my collaborator.
Last speaker is Wendell Wallach from Yale University, who will be speaking on the illusion of a technological moral fix.
Okay, how are we going to navigate the promise and perils of emerging technologies? Which one should we be embracing? Which one should we be rejecting? What should we regulate? Not an easy problem at all, and one that's been concerning me over the last few years. It's viewed in so many different ways. Some people see it as an evolution in human capabilities. Others are deeply concerned whether we're talking about a devolution and compromising, the rather remarkable creatures that we are. I get very concerned about the background suggestion that there are flaws in nature that our technologies will help us perfect, and whether that is really the view we should be deriving from a lot of the science that we look at. And I think whether or not that's true, as with many things, has a lot to do with how we frame the story. So we've had a lot of different framings of some fascinating scientific findings. I think a lot of you, like me, have been very taken by the findings themselves, not always convinced by some of the ways in which they're being appropriated to justify a certain kind of political and moral conclusions. So there's a framing I like. I'm pretty much a pro-science guy, and therefore, it's the Big Bang, it's evolution. Do you recognize this scene?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So we all, if you all don't know it, you probably would have had the music to Thus Spake Zarathustra in the background. But this is Stanley Kubrick's representation from 2001 of when our primate ancestors discovered that a bone could be used as a tool or a weapon, and thus setting in motion the co-evolution of humanity and its technologies. By our best understanding, that ancestor goes back over 2 million years ago and was probably Homo habilis, or at least that's what we know from anthropological evidence. A very different creature, very different from us. But we're also very different from the Homo sapiens sapiens that came on the Earth 150 years ago, even though they had more or less the same genes that we have. And just to give you an example of that, let's just consider our ancestors 200 years ago. By our standards, they were provincial, unscientific, unsanitary, filled with sexual, racial, class prejudices. No doubt they'd have less than complimentary things to say about us. But humanity was about to be transformed. It was transformed by the Industrial Revolution, then by the germ theory revolution in medicine, and then by the sanitation revolution. And we are very much a product of that. And I think the concern that some of us have is that you can interpret what is taking place as a natural following upon that in the ways in which science and technology have enhanced us as a species, or you can look at this new transformation that we are beginning or moving into as a radical inflection point that could have all kinds of results, some positive, some negative. And it was interesting to me when we raised our hands yesterday that generally the majority of people in the room expressed disquiet with questions of enhancement, questions of moral enhancement. There seems to be a worldwide disquiet about that, and there are all kinds of questions about whether that disquiet is reflective of a kind of conservatism or irrationality, or whether it is tied to some deep intuition that is something more than disturbed emotion. A lot of what's going on in that conversation, I think wave one, as Eric would have called it, has been a battle to frame the debate. For those on the pro-enhancement side, that has had a number of elements to it, to identify with science, to suggest this as the next inevitable stage of evolution, to characterize the critics sometimes in uncomplimentary ways, to diffuse the therapy enhancement distinction. But what we also see a lot of is the killer apps, the ways in which enhancement might bring about things that would be hard for most of us to reject. If we had those applications, we would all go out and buy the iPhone of enhancement tomorrow. And the killer apps are intelligence, what would give us a competitive advantage. Very few people would reject longer life, presuming that longer life was a healthy longer life. And indeed, science is giving us a longer life. 150 years ago, the average lifespan was 38 years. By 2008, average lifespan had doubled to 78 years, and it is continuing to grow between 2 and 4 years per decade. Though we still don't know whether there's a ceiling of our lifespan that could go beyond 120 years, or of course there are people like Aubrey de Grey out there claiming that that would be the case. But now we have moral enhancement, another killer app, isn't it? I mean, who could argue against moral enhancement? And why are we even considering arguing against it? Well, I don't necessarily join in. I don't know if you can read that little red cartoon in the right hand, but it says basically there's a killer app out there and it has to be stopped. Is moral enhancement a killer app that needs to be stopped? I don't know that it needs to be stopped, but I am your friendly skeptic. Like many others, I'm deeply skeptical that we will be able to enhance morality, but I'm friendly to it in the sense that I'm also fascinated, like you are, of the science underpinning it, and what might be the application of that, even though I'm concerned about what the dangers of it are entailed in all that. And part of that comes from a concern of the biases that I think I sometimes share with many conservatives that I see as implicit in the scientific method. I think there's a tendency to represent human beings as flawed machines. The reductionist nature of scientific endeavor has us focusing on individual mechanisms and reducing the processes or capabilities that we have to their neural correlates or their neurochemistry, as if just altering that is all that's entailed in behavior. And there is the problem with how much determinism is implicit in the scientific process and whether we should be buying into that. Is there any reason why we should consider that human behavior is any different than the physical behavior, the more determined physical behavior we see when we look at non-biological matter? And even when we entertain the question that we may not be totally determined beings, the scientific method seems to suggest that if we have will, it's very weak, and that there's an awful lot about human nature that is pretty hard to change. So I think that implicit bias is there, and we sometimes go along with that without giving it full inspection, or it comes up with our philosophical discussions. When we talk about our evolutionary ancestry, we talk a lot about design flaws, or we talk about systematic errors, systematic biases. Alan Buchanan is wonderful on the subject of design flaws. He points out, would an intelligent designer have created an eye that had a blind spot? And he goes on with so many other examples. The one I love as an older man is, would an intelligent designer have put the urethra through the prostate gland? Okay, let's move on. For me, the question for my whole life has been this question of a moral compass. How do we know what's right, good, and just? Do we have a moral compass in us? And if so, what would that moral compass be grounded in? Where does it get its direction from? And of course, there have been so many answers throughout the thousands of years of human history. God and the good, or perhaps we have evolved moral sentiments that have been structured and honed through social and political influences. There's a view of, well, it really all comes down to right reason or consequentialist calculations. And I've always been interested in this looking for the moral compass. But in looking for a moral compass, it's got me very caught up in the questions of, well, what are the foundations of moral reason or moral behavior? For 2,000 years, we were dominated by the Stoic worldview that was also more or less adopted by Plato, by Spinoza, by so many other philosophers, that moral decision-making depended upon dispassionate reasoning. And if there was any disagreement about that, it always focused on the emotions. So for Aristotle, emotions weren't good or bad, but the right emotion in the right place at the right time was a positive. That developed over the last few hundred years with Blaise Pascal and David Hume wanting to put preeminence on the emotions with a theory of moral sentiments. And now more recently with this reflection on moral intelligence, or the essential role, emotional intelligence, the essential role that emotional intelligence plays And the fascinating thing about that is we're getting more and more into this looking at the substrate of moral intelligence and moral intuitions and moral sentiments with some arguments that we are a collection of unconscious and computational processes, somatic markers that have been finally honed by experiences, and that collectively are the lattice upon which our reason is built. Which is a very different view than reason being something totally separate from our intuitive and emotional capacities. System 1, System 2, this kind of distinction between what the unconscious processes do and what the conscious processes do has become a particularly popular theme in the last few months with Daniel Kahneman's book. We're rethinking the is-ought distinction. I flagged my own book up there that I co-authored, Moral Machines Teaching Robots Right from Wrong, with Colin Allen. And our project, perhaps sneakily, in the guise of looking at whether we could implement moral decision-making faculties in computers and robots, I think we took perhaps an unusually comprehensive view of what comes into play when you look at moral decision-making faculties. Because it's very hard to believe that you're going to get an artificial agent with adequate moral behavior from reason alone. So there's all these super-rational faculties which are pointing toward skills that we would need to, if not reproduce in a robot, at least achieve their functional equivalent within any artificial agent we created from the bottom up. And that includes consciousness, theory of mind, being embodied in a world with other agents and other entities, familiarity with social practices, and the integration of those through unconscious mechanisms. I could go on and on and on. Every time I list them, somebody says, yes, but this is more important than those. So there's all these secondary concerns that we kind of take for granted or come up on the fringes of our discussion of morality, but may be essential to be a moral agent, even though many of these capabilities are not explicitly about morality. They serve many other functions. So moral enhancement. Luckily, I don't really have to go through this in much detail because it's come up so much in our conversation so far. But when we're talking about moral enhancement, we keep talking about enhancing or optimizing specific cognitive faculties. And some of them may be explicitly moral, and many of them are not. So we're talking about the regulation of emotions, the strengthening of moral sentiments, the enhancement of attention and analytical skills, the improvement of will and self-control, the facilitation of strength and courage. And so far, we have a limited number of drugs that get discussed here, the serotonin uptake inhibitors and testosterone. The big three that seem to get talked about the most are propranolol, oxytocin, and modafinil. I'm not going to talk about oxytocin at all because we just had quite a bit on it, and Matthew's going to do a whole session on I assume. That's the one that seems to be the most explicit when we talk about a morality pill. Modafinil is clearly not about morality per se, but it certainly does enhance attention and analytical skills, as does Adderall and Ritalin. And in a certain sense, you can argue well, they also increase what is sometimes called mental energy, which contributes to improved will, self-control, which is essential if you're going to be a good moral agent. Well, let me talk just for a moment about propranolol. What we know about propranolol is it's a regulator of memory encoding, and particularly the, okay, all right. I'm going to run a few minutes over, but I will try and get you to lunch soon. So about propranolol, okay, it interferes with the noradrenaline neuromodulator, and therefore it has a lot to do with the encoding of emotional memories. There's all kinds of questions about it, whether it could be used as a prophylactic, whether it can be used to facilitate the reconsolidation of memories or attitudes in more positive fashions. None of that's proved, none of that's been tested, there's a little preliminary evidence that shows it can reduce implicit racial biases. Some people have argued it can reduce guilt. So you could actually take it after the fact. You could do something quite heinous, take propranolol, and you wouldn't carry the burden of guilt with you. So is that a positive moral benefit or is it a negative one? So I think that becomes this big question of all these different capabilities that optimize. They may be appropriate for therapeutic applications, but their efficacy for enhancement has yet to be proved. Though a lot of that's empirical questions that we might research, but they have their downsides. They have side effects and they have secondary effects. But they're also going to be used as cognitive cocktails with little research going on, and that's where the danger lies in. Students mixing all kinds of cognitive enhancers in the hopes that they are going to modulate their neurological systems in positive ways, and it could easily be in detrimental ways. Aristotle pushed the middle way, and my only point that I really want to make here is any individual faculty you enhance will have its downsides. So courage could lead to foolhardiness, enhancing will can be misdirected, or at least not directed toward moral ends. Trust makes one easily dupable, sensitivity can make one vulnerable and indecisive. But the other thing I just want to underscore here as I try and move toward completing my presentation a bit is this whole question of integration. It's not just a question of enhancing an individual faculty, as I think Molly was trying to point out, that you're entering into a very complex neurological system. You don't know how it's going to reset itself. You don't know whether enhancing that faculty is something that's going to be effectively integrated with all the other capabilities and faculties you have, and how they are going to be altered in ways that may be positive. Some will be beneficial, but some may be quite harmful. And the other part of this integration concern is when we talk about them as individual optimizers, we keep severing them from effort and intention. And effort and intention may have an awful lot to do with whether or not any drug we take in any way, shape, or form can be integrated without side effects. So, as I finish up, I want to move in a slightly different direction. Is being a moral human being had a very different meaning for the last few thousand years. It had a more holistic meaning than this kind of reductionist looking at particular faculties. It had to do with becoming a virtuous being or living the happy life, the fulfilled life. It had to do with transcendence and self-realization. And I think the difficulty is that we don't lose sight of that expression of what it means to be a human, a moral being, an integrated being when we talk about these individual pharmacological agents. And the difficulty is this binocularity, or what I like to call it just both sides now. So both sides now is you all understand this representation of a cube. You can look at it two ways, but you can't look at it both ways at the same time. And it's how do we keep those two different orientations in mind? How do we address this question of moral enhancement while not losing sight of the fact that we are integrated beings and our morality has a lot to do with our embodied presence, has to do with our ability to accommodate an array of competing forces both internally and in our relationship to the environment we move through. And when we talk about these individual faculties, what we're really talking about is aspects about that. Yes, we have a plethora of unconscious mechanisms, but those unconscious mechanisms each represent a facet, and in many ways they compensate for each other. They are not standalone. So let me just move on here and just have three closing points, and I'm just going to read those three closing points. Yes, we're going down this road. I don't see anything that's going to stop us from down this road, but let's keep three things in mind. Just as there is no center for consciousness of the self in the nervous system, there's no moral compass or moral subsystem in the brain. Secondly, in elucidating the various capabilities that contribute to the development of character, sensitivity to moral considerations, and right reasoning, we're only beginning to put in place the pieces for more comprehensive understanding of moral behavior. And finally, the entire human organism is a moral navigation system. Each of us takes our direction from our relationship to our environment as a whole. And what we need to keep in mind is it's these words, relationship, and as a whole, that capture the moral